Great. Trevor, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about business models, and I call it business model design because I think we need to look at the way we do business and the way we create business models in a slightly different way. So what I'm going to talk about is based on a book that's called Business Model Generation. And we wrote about this a couple of years back, and we thought we should also do it with an innovative business model. You can't just write about business model innovation and not do it. So we decided to do it in a very different way. The first thing we changed was the product. We thought, hey, let's make a different kind of management book, one that's extremely visual, because we're talking about complex phenomena in the world. Business models are relatively complex. You want to understand and see. So we made it very visual, very practical. So we changed that part, and I think that was a big success in terms of differentiation. But then we also changed the business model. We decided to self-publish, so not to go to the publishers, which is pretty easy today. But we also decided to do it with people out there in the world who already use our methods, the methods I'm going to talk a little bit about, because we thought, hey, it makes much more sense to work with practitioners. So we got 470 people from 45 countries to participate. Now that's not very special, but what's very special is we asked them to pay to join us and help us write the book. So some of my friends says, well, this sounds like fraud. You're writing a book, you're getting others to do the work, and they're paying you for that? Well, we actually figured out what people really want. And when you know what they want, they're willing to pay for that. And the one thing that we really worked on was, create something together and could be a potential bestseller, which turned out to be true afterwards. We couldn't prove it, obviously. The impact, well, first thing is, through this different business model, we did turn it into one of the top management books, one of the top books on Amazon. For a while, it's always around the top 100, so it competes against Harry Potter and so on. But then more importantly, the methods in the book are being used now all over the world, and that's very exciting to see. So here are a couple of big companies, but it's used in governments, in not-for-profits, and that's really exciting because it does have an impact. So people are looking at business and business models differently because of some of the things that we wrote about. And one thing for you, be aware that even in the furthest corners of the world, people are reading Business Model Generation, and Zulu warriors with a Business Model Generation book is a dangerous combination. So before I give you a quick outline of what I want to talk about, the three things I want to talk about, I'll take you into my Swiss time machine. And I want to take you back to 1958 and present you somebody that I learned about from Henry Chesbrough, who you might probably know from Open Innovation, teaches at Berkeley. And he introduced me to this person called, at least in his book, and through the talks we had, to a guy called Chester Carlson. Anybody heard of Chester Carlson? Probably not. Well, he changed office life, the life people had in offices over decades, because he was head of a research team that invented the first modern-day photocopying machine. Now that machine could make 2,000 copies a day at a time where you could make 15 to 30 copies with a pretty smelly process. Problem was, this machine was too expensive. So what would they do? So they went to the consultants and they asked them, what should we do with this machine? What do you think the consultants told them? Great technology, very expensive. What should they do? The company was called Haloid. Anybody ever heard of Haloid? So the consultant said, shelf the technology. There's no market. Well, Haloid didn't listen, and they figured out a different business model, which was to bring the technology to the market through leasing. So if you're responsible for buying, let's say, in 1958, the copying machines, I come to you and say, hey, look, we'll lease this machine to you for $95 per month, and you get 2,000 copies for free. Right? That covers your needs. If you make a couple more copies, you're going to pay a few cents per copy, per additional copy. So what happened? Companies leased the machines, and they started photocopying, not 2,000 times a month, but 2,000 times a day, which means from day 2 onwards, they started earning money on the photocopies. Then they turned into Xerox, and they had 40% growth rates per year. Okay. Anywhere else than at Google, this is always an impressive number, right? But it's pretty impressive that they didn't listen to the consultants. They decided to find a different business model. So let's go in the time machine again. I'll take you to 2001. And I will introduce you to one of your friends here in the region, a bit further away. And he introduced another interesting innovation. Again, a product innovation, but combined iPod with iTunes, right? So it was not just the technology, it was also the software that went with it. It's a different thing that they brought to the market. Now, if you compare those two examples, what would you say they have in common? First one and the second one. What's similar? If you think of Xerox and you think of Google. Xerox with a photocopying machine and Apple with the iPod. What do they have?
Once you're bought into one, you're kind of bought into it for life.
Right? It's difficult to get out. Yeah? Anything else? Nothing striking?
Well, it's a transactional model, so the more you use it, the more revenue it generates.
Yeah. I'll give you 3 points. There are obviously many, but 3 points that I find really interesting here. First one is that the product alone was not sufficient. Now, we focus on products a lot, right? We spend a lot of money for product R&D. How much time do we spend on the business model? Something there, right? Second point, well, they couldn't look outside and copy the business model. They had to invent something new. And often we look around us to see, well, what's there? What do we need to do? But not always do we think of inventing a new business model. But I think we should try, at least, to figure out, could there be other business models than those that already exist? And the third one, well, there's a certain risk to developing new business models, and we want to be able to handle that risk, but we need to experiment not just with products, but also with business models. Maybe in a similar way that we experiment with products, we need to do that with business models, okay? Those are the 3 points that lead me into this discussion. Well, how do we actually create innovative, interesting, powerful new business models? So the 3 points give us the 3 themes. First one, well, what actually is a business model? How can we look at this beyond the product in an organization? We'll use this as a language. We'll use something there that's called a business model canvas. Then we'll look at design thinking. How do we create new business models? How do we come up with them? How can we work like designers when we create business models? And then this third point about risk, that's where I connected back to Steve Blank, who Trevor already mentioned. And I'll just give you an overview of what we're starting to look at, okay, in the last couple of slides. So first thing, business models as a language. Now, what I want you to do now is work in groups of 2, buzz group. It's not an hour we can lay back. You've got to work. And I'll give you a very simple question, but I'm curious about the outcome. We're going to define what a business model is. So your task for about a minute is to ask yourself, well, what is a business model for you? What's a business model? And write down your definition, okay? In groups of 2, 1 minute, let's go. What's a business model? Who's never used the word business model? All of us do, right? So you know what it is. Let's write it down. Okay, maybe write something down before you search a definition on the internet. First reflex. Write something down? Or just, okay. Let's do this together. So, first one, when you discussed what a business model is, what kind of elements came up? What were the things that you discussed? What do you describe when you describe a business model? Usage, profitability. Game? Okay, what do you mean with that? Okay, great. That's an interesting one. Anything else? Risk, okay, you want to discuss risk?
Talk about value generation.
Value generation. Okay, so when you would have to define it, what would be your definition? I heard some sentences here. What would you give as a definition? Anyone?
We just said how businesses make money.
How businesses make money, okay, very short, precise.
Relationship between revenue and costs.
Okay? Anything else?
The means of generating value from product or service.
Okay. So I asked this question all over the world. Same question, yeah?
Bringing the idea of money into your manufacturing process, the whole business process that
Okay, so you introduce the process, maybe the system, right? I asked this question all over the world, and you get the same thing everywhere. This is a word we use all the time, just like that. But we don't speak about the same thing. Everybody has a different mental model. Some people speak about processes, some really focus just on the money part, profitability. Some think about channels, some more about product value proposition, but we don't work with the same mental model. Now, is that a problem? Not per se, but now imagine 5 people around a table. People from marketing, from product development, IT, finance, and we all have a different mental model. Imagine what you get after a 3 hours meeting. What do you get? Not much, because it's all over the place. The discussion will go from strategy and vision to reinventing the business model to processes to technology to the people you want to hire. It's pretty much of a mess. So that's what we saw 10 years ago when we started our research at the University of Lausanne. And we wanted to find a language that would make this discussion around business models much clearer. So we tried to figure out, could you describe business models in a more structured way without making it overcomplicated? Okay? So we came up with something that we call the business model canvas. And we use the word canvas deliberately, because on a canvas you draw something, right? You paint something. Now the analogy to business models is you can paint an existing business model, discuss it, improve it. You have a good discussion because you make it tangible, visual. And when you talk about future business models, it's even more important to make it tangible and visible, because we're, by definition, talking about the unknown, what we're going to do, what we're going to invent. So you want to have a language there. So it's very simple. It's a language that allows you to describe, challenge, and ultimately invent business models in a slightly more systematic way than we do until now. And it's about 9 building blocks. So you can describe a business model with 9 building blocks, which are pretty straightforward. Let's go through them very quickly. First one, customer segments, users. All right, if you take a newspaper, what would let's take the Wall Street Journal. What are the key customer segments of the Wall Street Journal? What would you say? Finance. What else? Who else? Readers. Advertisers, right? So you have 2 main groups. All the readers, decision makers, finance people, analysts, and you have the advertisers. There's a so-called double-sided market like Google, right? You have 2 very different segments, and for each segment, you'll have a different value proposition. Just like you have a value proposition for advertisers, and you have a value proposition for people who search, right? So it's about mapping this out. Then we want to ask ourselves, well, how do these customer segments want to be reached? How do the advertisers want to be reached, or can be reached efficiently, and how do the readers want to be reached? So you start talking about the channels. It's not just distribution channels, it's all the channels, the customer interface, the way you discuss and meet and interact with customers, okay? Then you ask yourself, well, what kind of relationships do I build with customers? Pretty straightforward. If you're a private bank, well, you'll have a personal relationship based on bankers. If you're Google or Amazon, well, you might have a personalized relationship based on systems and algorithms. 2 very different types of relationships that have a consequence on the business model. It can be transactional, it can be long-term, it can be acquisition, it can be retention, right? Different types of relationships. And then you want to ask yourself, well, what are people really willing to pay for? People or companies, your customer segments. What are they willing to pay for and how? Through which revenue streams? Well, take books today, or news. Are people still willing to pay for books and news? Well, maybe. Maybe they're more willing to pay for a device. Maybe there's a cross-subsidy there, right? So we need to ask ourselves, what kind of revenue streams and what kind of pricing mechanisms? Now that's the value we create, how we deliver it, and how we capture the value. Now you want to ask yourself, well, what infrastructure do we need to do that? What kind of key resources? Do I need servers? Do I need intellectual property? Do I need factories? What is it that I really need in terms of assets? And then you want to ask yourself, well, what is it that I really do? What are the most important things that I do in my business model? Is it programming? Is it managing servers? Is it marketing? What are the key things there? The key activities. And then you want to ask yourself, with which partners am I going to work? Because they can leverage my business model. So it's not just about doing it yourself or doing it with somebody else. Often, it's about leveraging partners. So if you're Zynga, well, you build games on Facebook, that's a huge leverage to their business model, right? They probably wouldn't have gotten there if they couldn't piggyback on Facebook, right? And then once you know the key resources, activities, and partners, very quickly you can sketch out the cost structure. So 9 pretty simple building blocks. Is any building block there new to you? Of course not. But how many times have you sketched out the business model, for example, for a product, in a holistic way like that? But that's pretty important because a lot of the innovation is happening now in the big picture. Of course, product innovation is still important. Of course, addressing new segments is still important. But some of the most powerful business models, they look at the system, the big picture, all 9 building blocks. So that's the concept. Let's turn it into a tool. Let's take away the clutter and turn it into a canvas, a pre-structured canvas, where we have the 9 building blocks in a slightly different way, and we can start mapping out a business model. We can ask ourselves, well, who are the key customers? What are we offering each of them? How are we reaching them? And so on. So very quickly, you map out a business model, and you get a holistic picture. And very often when you do this, so if you do it for an existing business model, what's powerful is the process of getting there with a group of 5 to 6 people, not necessarily the end product. Because when 5 people in the room decide, yes, these are our main channels, or these are the main channels that we want to use, there's a pretty big consensus there. So you have a much more tangible discussion, much more concrete than if you don't use a visual tool like this. Okay? And we're going to do it together afterwards. So let me give you an illustration. Since I mentioned the iPod, I'll use that one because it's a nice systemic view. So let's look at the offer. Let's keep it simple, straightforward. I'll go through it quickly because you know it. It's just about visualizing it. And then I'll get you to work on one example, okay? So seamless music experience, great design. Customer segments, high-end mass market. What kind of channels do they use? Or did they use when they started 2001, 2002? What were the channels for the iPod? What would you say? Okay, yeah. E-commerce.
Best Buy.
Retailers, yeah. Okay. Anything else? What's the most important channel in their business model? The Apple stores. Okay.
And
iTunes, right? Retail stores, Apple website, do a lot of e-commerce. We all know Apple stores. But then this one. The software, iTunes, and the iTunes store. That's an important channel, particularly when they started out because they were the first to really focus on that. Right? Now, remember 1,000 songs in a pocket? Well, why did they want to do that? Well, on the one hand, okay, rejuvenate their Lovemark brand, but on the other hand, once you have your songs in the iPod, you copy them or you bought them, how easy is it to switch? They were the first to really focus on switching costs in the MP3 player market, right? So 1,000 songs in a pocket was anything else than innocent. Once you're in that system, it's pretty hard to get out. Well, hard. It just takes some effort, right? Revenue streams. we all know, okay? The one hand, the hardware, but high margins. And on the other hand, the songs. Now what's interesting there is, how do they earn most money for the first 5, 6, 7 years? How did they earn most money in this system? Hardware, right? But why do they do the songs? If this was just cost covering. Because they need it to create this seamless music experience. It's a system. And they wanted to build that up. So let's look at this side. What are the key resources to do that? What would you say? The key resources for iPod, iTunes to do that? Straightforward.
Great design.
Great designers, absolutely. What else?
Manufacturing.
Manufacturing, okay, being the activities. Speechless Googlers, that's a surprise. Okay, very simple. It's not rocket science, probably too easy, right? But it's about mapping it out. So designers, absolutely, talented people. Then the intellectual property in the hardware, intellectual property in the software, the integration between both, right? They focused a lot on that. Then the Apple brand. But the most important key resource is still missing.
Music, how do I get a relationship?
Right. The content agreements with the record labels. That's a key differentiator, and they were the first to push that. So what they did here enabled this here, iTunes software, iTunes Store, and the integrated music experience. That business model is pretty different from anything that existed then in that specific market. It's not just the product, which was also different if you want, but it's the system, okay? Key activities, I'll go through it quickly. Hard software design, outsourcing of the manufacturing, supply chain management, as you said, marketing and sales, which would give us the cost, okay? The same. People, design and development, the marketing, and the hardware manufacturing, okay? So the entire business model on one picture. And why do I use Apple? Because it's interesting if you look how they extended that business model to the iPhone and then to the iPod. It was not just a series of new products. It was an extension and change of the business model. So you could nicely map this out and see which elements did they add on, which elements were a great base. Now it's much more, it's easier to discuss these things when you have a visual to discuss them and to think them through. Right? Don't underestimate the visual part here. Now let me get you to do a slight exercise. So this is what I said. These were the most important differentiators. But let's do a little exercise together. So we got here some canvases. I'm going to get you to work in groups of 2 because the doing is the most important. So I'm going to get you to work for about 6 minutes. And what I want you to do in groups of 2 again, buzz groups, is, and get some post-it notes here as well. 1 per group of 2. I want us to work on a business model. This is not pure technology. I thought it was good to talk about physical stuff and coffee, right? It's important for anybody working in the tech industry. Commodities product. And I want to look at this question first before we get to the example. How much do you think did the cost for home coffee consumption change over the last couple of years in Switzerland? So not Starbucks and so on, but the price we pay for coffee at home, for the coffee we consume at home, same amount, how much less or more do you think we pay in this commodities business? What do you think? More? How much would you say? Percentage-wise, a guess? 25% more? Okay, commodities business?
It's like 2x.
2 times more, okay? It's 6 to 8 times more. And the Swiss are not known for throwing money out of the window. Promise you that. Okay? Why is it? What do you think?
Home espresso machine.
Home espresso machines already existed, but it was particularly Nespresso. Okay? It wasn't George Clooney alone. He does the advertising for Nespresso throughout Europe. In the US, I'm not sure. But it was Nespresso with their business model that they brought to the market. Okay? So the way it works, who has ever seen or used an espresso machine? Okay? Who has one at home? Okay, great. Do you know the business model? Okay, I'll let you work it out. So the way it works, very simple. You have these machines, well designed, and you have these pods, and you put the pods in the machine, you press a button, and a great espresso comes out. Espresso with crema on top, everything. A really good one. And consumer tests show that they are better than others. Now, what's interesting are the results. And again, I mean, the numbers are always a bit relative when you go to Google. But what's impressive is, in Switzerland, we have garbage collection sites in every village. It's the only company with their own recycling containers. So this picture is made at my little village, where people bring their pods back. The only company, okay? Then if we look at the numbers, it's still one of the fastest growing divisions within Nestlé. You all know Nestlé, right? And had about 35% growth per annum for the last 8 years. Again, numbers are relative, right? But it's pretty impressive that they got to 3 billion Swiss francs of revenue with this physical product, and it's one product line, right? Physical product line. So scalability is not as easy as when you're in the digital world. So Buzz Group, I'll give you, let's say, 6 minutes to sketch out on the canvas what you think could be the business model of Nespresso. If you don't know at all, ask yourself, well, how, if you were the product manager or the CEO of this organization when they started out, how would you design their business model? Okay? So this is the product. This is what you have. Now, the way I want you to work is how I get people to work with the canvas. It's with Post-it notes. So don't write on the canvas. It's a sacred thing. You never write on a canvas. Use Post-it notes. So customer segment, Post-it note. If you have a second customer segment, it's a second Post-it note. And you quickly sketch out just the main elements, not all of them, right? Why do I insist on Post-it notes? Because you can move them around. So if you have one element per Post-it note, you can easily move it around. This is less important when you sketch it out, but when you want to play, when you think of new business models, then it's really important. To say, oh, this is not a really interesting market, you take it away. What are the consequences for the other building blocks? Then you can play. So what we're starting here is playing with business models, okay? Let's go, 6 minutes. What could the business model of Nespresso be? How would you design it? First thing, I mean, you can see some of the text is really small because this is designed for a big poster. Because what you want to do is you want to put something like this on the wall and work with a group of a couple of people to sketch out a business model. Now, you only had 6 minutes, and I saw most of you sketched out an entire business model. That's pretty powerful in 6 minutes. Right? You looked at it not just from the product point of view, but you sketched out a holistic business model. An additional point, how many of you have been in a situation where somebody tried to explain their business model to you, whatever tech company or so, and after 10 minutes you still didn't understand at all what were the key points of their business model? Who's never been in that situation? All of us, right? Now, that's a big issue. It's a problem. What you want to be able to do is sketch it out, put the main points up there very quickly. So we need a language, and a visual language is very powerful to do that. Now, let's get to Nespresso. What would you say, so we're not going to sketch out the whole thing, I'll show you how they actually did it. But what would you say are the main points of their business model? What do you think, what would you have done as the main elements of the business model? What are the key things? What would you say? Anybody?
Provide really good coffee and it's very, very easy to use.
Okay, easy to use, great. Good coffee. What else? What is the key point to make this a success, to get to where they got to? What do you think? You know the business model. But let's wait.
This would be really easy to be able to buy the little pouches for customers. So
Okay.
logistics.
Okay. Really easy. Let's see if somebody, yeah?
How to convince people, the Swiss particularly, that they need a premium coffee at this cost?
Okay. Question is, how do you convince them? Good. Yeah.
And I think like the existing machine might be very expensive, and with this can go and razor and blade model.
Yeah.
Make the machine relatively cheap.
Yeah.
And charge a little bit premium for the pods.
You just won a box of Swiss Army knife chocolates. First to get it, right? And we'll do another one. You'll get, the next one will be for a limited edition of the business model generation. Okay? So that is probably the main point. And I'll show you how they did it. So we'll go through it very quickly. Nespresso's choice. So there's several possible business models if you have a machine like that. And the first time they tried, they didn't succeed. So this is the business model that succeeded. So you could say it's like a home barista experience, but it's composed of machines and pods. Now if you look with it with the machines, they marketed them through all the retail outlets possible, and they didn't just start in Switzerland, they started in France and I think the Netherlands, particularly to households, 85%, and then also to businesses. So they earned some revenue through the sales of machines, but we'll see in the partner part, most of that, they leave it to the machine manufacturers. They don't manufacture the machines. Now, large reach to get the machines out there relatively cheap. Now where it gets interesting is in Nespresso pods. First through mail order, because they started out before the internet, then through call centers, then through Nespresso.com, and then through Nespresso stores. Only their own channels, not one retail channel that doesn't belong to them. Why would they do that?
They can charge what they want. They can charge what they want.
They can charge what they want. They capture all the value, which means the margins, right? There's no more intermediary. So they use intermediaries to get the machines out there, and then they use their own channels. So why would they start building stores if they could just use the internet? Doesn't make sense. That's costly, isn't it? Why would they do that? Samples, right?
Getting the brand visible.
Right. They want to be, it's not just visibility, it's actually the type of brand that they want to be. It's a luxury brand, high-end. It's very difficult to do high-end just through the internet. So they built stores, which are amazing. You can go to the Champs-Élysées and you'll find an Nespresso store at one of the most popular locations. So they use that for the chance, okay?
Is this similar to Apple again, that they have this retail terms?
That part is probably similar to Apple, but then they don't earn from the hardware. They earn, so that part is different. But there's some similarities. So in that sense, it's similar to Apple. Having these locations with the Nespresso products makes it very prominent and is very high-end. Beautiful stores. In that sense, it's very similar, but then they don't earn on the machines, but they earn on the pods. That would be the equivalent of the songs for Apple, right? But it's the other way around. So let's look at the key resources. What do they need? Well, they need patents to protect the system so nobody else can put pods in there. Production facilities. They produce the pods, not the machines. We'll see that over here. They need to own the distribution channels, and they obviously need the coffee, right? And they really focus on great quality coffee. So what do? Production, marketing, business to consumer logistics. That was totally new for Nestlé, who never marketed directly to consumers before. They only sold to retailers. So then on the partner side, coffee machine manufacturers, coffee growers, and then the costs, keep it simple, production, logistics, and marketing. Okay, so the business model sketched out on one slide. So what's interesting here is that that's the business model that worked. But at the very beginning, they tried a business model. The inventor of the machine was the CEO. They tried a business model that didn't work. And they failed. Exactly the same product. But they almost went bankrupt. Now, how did that work? What was the business model? It was the Nespresso system sold through the salespeople of the machine manufacturers to offices. So it was business to business. A very strong joint venture with machine manufacturers. Well, what they found out, A, these people were not interested, and B, the salespeople for the machine manufacturers had absolutely no reason to focus on selling Nespresso systems. So that business model fell apart. But then, instead of shutting down, they tried a new business model by bringing in a new CEO who totally changed the business model to what we've seen before. Same product, exactly the same product, two different business models. That was a difference here between success and failure. So, now let's look at how to craft business models. I'll give you one exercise. Yeah?
Question now. So you use so far to describe how to visualize this model.
Yeah.
But how do you evaluate whether this model is good or not?
Yeah.
It's not clear to me whether you have made that.
No, we'll get to that to the end, and I think it's very hard. But we'll look at that in the very last part. How do you evaluate business models? So design thinking attitude, how do you craft them? And here I think we need to work much more like designers, and I'll give you one example. Frank Gehry. Who knows Frank Gehry? One of the iconic buildings. Guggenheim Museum. Okay, there are many, particularly if you're from California. But this is the one I chose because I know a bit of the story behind it. Now, when Frank Gehry and his team tackle a challenge like that, the challenge was to transform the city through the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. Now, it's not heavenly inspiration that gets them to this building. It's a very difficult, creative process. And one of the things that I want us to look at in this creative process are prototypes, study models. So they do a lot of different study models, sketches, different materials before they get to the final building. So of 100 models, you will probably only recognize in 10% the final building. That's the way they work. Now, how many times do we do that for business models? So, what's the analogy here? Well, we often fall in love with our first business model that we come up with. Or we spend too much time on the first one rather than working like an architect. Rough sketch, another rough sketch, totally different direction, another rough sketch. And then focus. We often tend to go too deep too quickly with one specific business model. Does this sound familiar? I see some people going like this, right? So what we need to do is sketch out business models before we go deeper. So in a meeting, instead of discussing an idea alone and then choosing a direction that we're going to go deep on, it's better to take an hour and sketch out 4 or 5 different business models, take the 5 ideas in the room and sketch it out just like you did now. You'll have more meat on the bones to discuss, okay? And if we do that, we'll get to better business models. If we work more like designers. So, how does it work? Well, a canvas like that with people in a room sketching out maybe 4 or 5 different business models, or 30 people split in groups of 5, whatever, right? That's a very powerful mechanism to get to powerful business models. Let me just do one illustration. It's my favorite example, and I want to test your creativity. And the example that I'm using comes from the social entrepreneurship field. It's a Swedish company called Peepoopel. And they have a product called the Pee-Poo bag. This is not a joke. It's a single-use toilet bag, and what they're targeting are the 2.6 billion people who don't have access to proper sanitation. So, how does the product work? Well, it's a single-use toilet bag, self-sanitizing, it's biodegradable, it turns into fertilizer. That's a dream product, right? Right there. And it's mainly targeted at poor people, but not exclusively. So ultimately, they want to change the world, but you could sell it to other customer segments. And obviously, what's important here are low production costs. And another point that's really interesting is that there is already a market there. People pay, in slums, for example, for access to public latrines. So the market is there. Now, Peepoopel does not want to operate as a not-for-profit. They want to operate as a for-profit. So the question to you is, what could interesting business models be? So I won't get you to sketch one out, but I want you to come up with different business models. So the buzz group, and the person who gets the most ideas or has the most ideas will win the special edition of Business Model Generation. Buzz group is, Write down as many different business model ideas as possible for that specific product with those product features, okay? I'll give you 2 minutes, okay? What are some of the ideas that you came up with? Just 1 or 2 ideas each.
So in any case, you would probably want to sell the stuff to like agriculture or something to use as fertilizer.
Okay, so fertilizer is an obvious one here, right? But it's not that easy to do. There are reverse logistics involved, yeah?
Work with governments or funding agencies that are interested
Okay.
to improve sanitation, health care, and so on.
Right, so that would be the target segment rather than the end users maybe, yeah?
A model like Mary Kay, where you've got like the poo person from the neighborhood that.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Maybe another idea?
So to backpackers and outdoors.
Okay, so the point here is that you have, for exactly the same product as a starting point, very different possibilities. Licensing nobody brought up. Franchising nobody brought up, right? There are many different models. So I think what's important is that we start thinking of more business models for the same product starting point. Because, as I've shown you in some of the examples, the business model can leverage a product. So now count your examples. Count your examples. The ones of the ideas. How many ideas did you come up with? Okay. Who has how many? 5. Anybody more than 5? 6. Okay. 7 to beat. Anybody beat 7?
I had 9.
You have 9. Well, that's it. Perfect. Right. Special edition. They don't exist anymore. These were of the first self-published business model generations. So, let me finish. Oops. With the last point here, and then I'll get back to your question with this, and then we can open it up to questions for those who want to stay. So the question is, well, what is a successful business model? How can I find it and then implement it? Because that's related to the risk. Now, I think it's impossible to upfront qualify a business model as successful or not. It's relative, depending on the context, the industry, the sector, the organization itself. And more importantly, you still have to implement it. The best business model sounds trivial, right? But we often say that business model didn't work, but we don't check if it's the management team, the money that was missing, or if it was the business model itself. So one of the things that we want to do is we still want to figure out, well, how could we test the business model? If we can't say up front this is going to work or not, we need to test it. Can you test business models? Because basically, even the best business model on paper, something that looks really good, that makes a lot of sense, can fail because basically, it's nothing else than a set of guesses. It's already a step forward to the business plan, which is a big 30-page guess towards something that's on one page that you want to iterate. But still, it's a set of hypotheses underlying your business model. You want to test them. And I'm not going to go deep here because we're just in the process of starting to figure out how could this really look. Because Steve Blank, who you all know, has already done great work with the customer development process in showing how you can test those assumptions. So what we're doing now together with Steve is putting the methods, our methods together to say, okay, we're going to sketch out a business model on a canvas. How are we going to test these underlying assumptions? So one of his main theses is that what you really need to do, once you have that on paper, is you need to get out of the building and test the hypothesis. And obviously, when you're in the internet world, you want to test it through customer development, lean startup movement, right? You don't need to physically get out of the building, though it can help for many cases. You want to see people use things. But you want to test not just the product, but the business model, the different parts of the business model. So I think that's where we're going now, being able to test business models. Okay, one last thing. I can show this after. We're working on an iPad app to craft and test business models with the numbers. So you could sketch out, just like you did now, a business model and throw in ballpark figures and immediately know, hey, could this work? It's like a sanity test without ever opening a spreadsheet. And in a spreadsheet, it's hard to play. But in an iPad app or an Android app, of course, you can play. And we went for that rather than the web because I think the touch screen interface is really important. It makes it more intuitive. Okay? I can show a little demo afterwards for those who are interested. Great, that's it from my side. So I think for those who need to go, obviously free to go, but I'll stay here for a couple of questions for those who want to.
Who did you self-publish with?
Who did we self-publish with?
Yeah, when you did your self-publish.
We went for a printer in the Netherlands first. We printed a couple of thousand books, and then we sold it first through our own channels with a direct mailing company, which was a disaster. It was actually our plan B. Then we went back to Amazon. That was plan A. Just to ship, we shipped 10,000 books directly to Amazon after printing them in Canada, and they do everything.
Oh, okay.
So we self-published, and then we put it into their system, and then we sold the global publishing rights to Wiley. So that brought us to another level, obviously, because they have, you know, the physical channels which we didn't have when we did it ourselves. But it's amazing to see, and you know this, right? I mean, the publishing world and the authoring world and the reading world is changing so dramatically. It's amazing. And we thought, hey, if we do this, if we write about it, let's also do it. And we weren't sure that we could make a global bestseller, but we did. So that was pretty fun to see that it actually worked out, right? The way we planned. Any other questions to the content that we looked at? Who wants to see a quick demo of the app? Very quick. Great. So this is what in the lean startup world you call this a minimal viable product, right? Not the cheapest minimal viable product that you can imagine, but nevertheless it's still a prototype. But we built in some basic functions that we think already solve a problem, and that's how it's going to go on the App Store.
I'm not sure the display works with the iPad. It will. Give it time.
It will. So it's pretty slow because it's not made for projecting. So the animations that are smooth on the screen are not smooth here. But basically the idea is that you can create a business model canvas, and you can do the most basic thing, which is pull in the post-it notes and say, okay, well, this is going to be an app, and who are we targeting? Maybe entrepreneurs, consultants. How are we going to sell it? Through the App Store. What is the revenue stream going to be? App sales. Okay, that's what you can already do with paper. But the one thing in global corporations is that you want to be able to exchange the documents, and you want to play with them. But where it gets more interesting is if you press the button up in the left-hand corner and say, hey, we want to put in ballpark figures. So how many entrepreneurs are there? Okay, maybe something like 10,000, 100,000, whatever. You do the same for consultants. You start putting in some numbers. And then you choose the revenue streams. Say, well, I can pre-select from some of the basic things that are in here. Well, one would be sales. So you could sell an app. But we all know that Apple and in all these systems, there's a transaction cut. So we would switch to transaction cut, and we would start putting in the numbers. And you would immediately see the ballpark figures. I think because, let me see if this one works. App, sell it to entrepreneurs. Oop. We select this customer segment, 10,000. How many are we going to reach the first year? Oh, 30%. How much are they going to pay? 29. How much do we have to pay to Apple? 30%. How many times are they going to buy the app? Once a year. So not very promising. This is hardly going to cover the cost, right? But then if you do the same thing for subscription models, you can see the difference visually. So some of the things that we know that work, but we can play with it. You do the same thing for costs. You play with fixed costs and variable costs. You can really play with the business model. Something that usually takes more time in a spreadsheet, you can do in 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I think that's the fun part of it, that we want to go more towards business model prototyping. That's it. That's the little demo that we're working on. And then we're going to do a web version after this one. This is going to be out probably in about a month on the App Store.